In February 1912, a 6-year-old boy named Puyi signed a document he could not read, ending a dynasty that had governed China for nearly 3 centuries. He was carried from the throne room by his nurse. Outside the Forbidden City, a country of 400 million people was already becoming something else entirely. The Qing had not been overthrown in a single revolution. They had been dissolving for a century before anyone admitted it. The collapse of the Qing Dynasty is one of the most consequential political failures in modern history. It reshaped a civilization. It produced decades of war, instability, and transformation that are still unfolding today. And at its center is a question that every failing institution eventually confronts: the question of whether reform is possible, without first acknowledging the depth of what has gone wrong. The Manchu Qing came to power in 1644, not as a native Chinese dynasty, but as conquerors from the northeast who swept through a Ming court already weakened by internal rebellion, fiscal collapse, and military failure. They were outsiders. They knew it. And for the first century of Qing rule, that knowledge made them capable administrators. The Kangxi and Qianlong emperors, who between them ruled for more than a century, governed with a genuine intelligence about the precariousness of their position. They learned Chinese. They absorbed Confucian governance frameworks. They were careful, strategic, and militarily effective. But the Qianlong emperor, whose reign stretched from 1735 to 1796, also contained within it the seeds of what would follow. He was a man of extraordinary cultural confidence. He compiled the imperial library, patronized the arts, and conducted military campaigns across Central Asia with a certainty about China's position in the world that would, within decades of his death, be exposed as deeply mistaken. In 1793, the British diplomat Lord Macartney arrived in Beijing on behalf of King George III, seeking to open trade relations. Qianlong famously declined. His letter to the British king was composed with complete composure. China, he explained, possessed all things in abundance. There was nothing Britain could offer that China required. The tributary system in which foreign nations approached China as subordinates seeking imperial favor remained, in Qianlong's view, the appropriate framework for all foreign relations. This was not mere arrogance. It was a coherent worldview, built across centuries of genuine Chinese cultural and economic superiority. For most of human history up to that point, China had been the largest economy on Earth. The tributary system had worked. The Confucian administrative model had produced stable governance across vast populations for longer than most civilizations had existed. Qianlong's confidence was, historically speaking, well-founded. It was also, in 1793, approximately 40 years from catastrophic obsolescence. The Industrial Revolution was transforming Britain's military and economic capacity at a pace that no established civilization had encountered before. The gap between European military technology and Qing military technology, which had been manageable in the early 18th century, became decisive by the early 19th. The Qing court did not track this gap. They had no institutional mechanism for taking foreign military developments seriously, because their entire conceptual framework held that there was nothing serious to learn from barbarian nations. The First Opium War arrived in 1839. British naval and ground forces moved through Chinese coastal defenses with a speed and effectiveness that stunned Qing commanders. The weapons were different. The tactics were different. The organizational capacity of the British military was operating in an entirely different register from the banner armies the Qing had relied upon for 2 centuries. The war ended in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanking, the first of what Chinese historians call the unequal treaties, ceding Hong Kong, opening 5 treaty ports, and imposing indemnities that began a slow fiscal hemorrhage the Qing never recovered from. What followed across the next several decades was a sequence of compounding crises that each, individually, might have been survivable, but collectively overwhelmed the dynasty's capacity to respond. The Taiping Rebellion, which began in 1850, was not a minor peasant uprising. It was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. A heterodox Christian movement, led by a man who believed himself to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ, mobilized millions of followers across southern China, established a capital at Nanjing, and controlled substantial territory for 14 years. Conservative estimates place the death toll between 20 and 30 million people. The Qing suppressed the rebellion eventually, but only by relying on regional military commanders with their own armies and their own agendas commanders whose loyalty to the dynasty was practical rather than absolute, and whose growing independence would matter enormously in later decades. This is a pattern visible across collapsing empires. Central authority, unable to manage a crisis directly, delegates emergency power to regional actors. The crisis passes. The delegated power does not return. The center finds itself governing a system it no longer fully controls, managing relationships with subordinates it can no longer afford to discipline. By the 1890s, the Qing court was attempting reform while simultaneously resisting it, a posture that managed to alienate modernizers without satisfying conservatives. The 100 Days Reform of 1898, initiated under the young Guangxu Emperor, proposed sweeping changes to education, the military, and the civil service. The Empress Dowager Cixi, who had governed from behind the throne for decades with considerable political skill, terminated the reform after 103 days, placed the emperor under house arrest, and executed 6 of the leading reformers. Her calculation was that radical change threatened the structures through which she held power. She was correct in the short term. In the longer term, she removed the last realistic opportunity for managed modernization. Cixi was not a fool. She was, by most serious accounts, the most capable political operator the late Qing produced. But her capabilities were calibrated to a system of court intrigue, factional management, and symbolic authority that had less and less purchase on the actual problems the dynasty faced. She was extraordinarily skilled at the politics of the Forbidden City. She was far less equipped to engage with industrialization, nationalism, or the expectations of a Chinese population that was increasingly aware that other models of governance existed. After the humiliation of the Boxer Uprising in 1900, in which Qing forces supported a violent anti-foreign movement that provoked an 8-nation military intervention and the occupation of Beijing, even conservative officials accepted that structural reform was unavoidable. The dynasty launched the new policies: military modernization, educational reform, the abolition of the ancient examination system in 1905, and tentative steps toward constitutional government. These reforms were real. They were also, by that point, fatally mistimed. The new military schools they built produced officers with modern training and nationalist politics. The new schools they opened educated a generation of young Chinese who read about democracy and self-determination and looked at the Manchu court as a foreign imposition. The reforms designed to save the dynasty systematically produced the people who would end it. When a regional military uprising began in Wuhan in October 1911, province after province declared independence not because of coordinated revolutionary organization, but because the Qing had spent decades quietly losing the loyalty of every institution capable of defending them. The army that might have suppressed the revolt had commanders who calculated that the dynasty was not worth the cost. They were right. What the Qing represent in historical terms is a civilization encountering modernity without the conceptual framework to recognize what modernity required of it. This is not a failure unique to China. The Ottoman Empire faced a structurally identical crisis across the same century. The difference between those who navigated the encounter and those who did not was rarely a matter of intelligence or even of will. It was a matter of whether existing institutions could tolerate the self-examination that genuine adaptation demands. The Qing could not. Every serious reform proposal threatened some constituency whose cooperation the dynasty needed to survive, and so each reform was partial, delayed, reversed, or captured by the interests it was meant to constrain. The system selected, consistently, for its own preservation over its own improvement, until preservation was no longer possible. A 6-year-old boy signed his name on a document and was carried away by his nurse, and 3 centuries of a civilization's governing logic went with him, not defeated, exactly, but exhausted. Exhausted by a world it had never fully agreed to understand.